Welcome everybody to the CTAP Samvaad talk. Today's talk is on COVID-19 and the Indian economy. What have the lockdowns taught us? This is to be delivered by Professor Vinod Vyasulu. In February, Professor Vyasulu had given us a talk at Samvaad on reflections on work, technology, and economy. At that time, he had put on his economist hat to lay out the historical trajectory of the relationship between work and technology since the onset of industrialization and modern capitalism. Today, he is donning the hat again and telling us about the stark reality of economic slowdown as a result of the lockdown due to the pandemic, and where does the government response find itself in the evolving situation. This talk will definitely help improve our collective understanding of this evolving yet significant situation. Professor Vinod Vyasulu is not a stranger here. He has a Ph.D. from the School of Business Administration in the University of Florida. He has taught in the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and XLRI, Jamshedpur. He was the director of the Institute of Public Enterprise, Hyderabad, and held the RBI Chair in the Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore. He also had a stint as economic advisor for small-scale industries in the National Small Industries Corporation, Delhi. He was the director of the Center for Budget and Policy Studies in Bangalore. Till recently, he was a professor and vice dean at Jindal School of Government and Policy in Sonipat, from where he returned to Bangalore because he needed to get away from the air pollution. Professor Vyasulu has had a long-standing association with CTAP at IIIT Bangalore. So that's for the introduction. Professor, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaya. The economist hat is a difficult one to talk about because in some sense, everybody is an economist. Things like prices and so on affect all of us. And everybody has opinions. So to sort out everybody's opinion from that small set called economists is sometimes not all that easy. I'd say the difference probably lies in the fact that the economists as a profession try to look at the economy a little more systematically, look at data and so on. Now, what I'm going to do is break this talk down into three parts. I want to start with the economy because to understand the impact, it would be important to know where we were before COVID, for example, say 1st January of this year. So I'll spend a little bit of our time explaining where we were and the kind of economic structure we have. And in that background, I'll talk about the COVID pandemic. Now, without knowing epidemiology and things like that, it's very, very difficult to speak. So what I will be doing is sharing my understanding of what I've been reading in a whole lot of articles that come up on the net. And it really cannot claim any kind of authority except the fact that articles I've read have been by great people. And after this, I'll try and talk about what we have learned. Now, we all know that the Indian economy suffered a long time decline under British rule. There have been different opinions about it, but I think the most recent one by Shashi Tharoor, which called it an era of darkness, has brought out certain factors to which he gives great weight and others give less weight. But the point he makes is that the structure of the economy was changed so that the focus became Britain. We did have, for example, some kind of shipbuilding industry, but that was not encouraged because the British wanted to monopolize it. We had a huge handloom industry all over the country, but the British decided to use the cotton that is grown as a raw material for the mills in Manchester. And then the manufactured product was brought back in. So this is the classic colonial economy, which is a provider of raw materials and imports finished goods. Now, in the abstract, there's nothing wrong with that. But these are not equal relationships. a colonial economy doesn't have the same kind of decision-making freedom as the colonizer. And therefore, many of the decisions that were taken with the idea of the British Empire rather than whatever was the landmass of India. Part of this included raising revenues of largely through agricultural taxation, but through other means as well. And these revenues, instead of being spent in India, were used abroad. So to a large extent, the industrialization of Britain during the Industrial Revolution was financed by India. Not totally, but in part. Now, this is all well known. On the other hand, we did get railways. We did get modern administration, a legal structure. Now, how we balance the pluses and minuses is something I leave aside. Let's start with independence. 47 was a very traumatic year, partition and so on, the integration of states. It was a very difficult time. So most economists really look at data from 1950 onwards. That's when the constitution more or less became operational. And between, say, 1900 and 1950, the growth rate per capita in India was probably between 0.1 or 0.3% of GDP. Extremely, we were basically a static economy. From 1950, when we began to make our own policies, and the planning era, up to about 1980, roughly speaking, the 70s was a period of turmoil. It was a period of rethinking. But if we look at 1950 to 1980, the economy grew at 3.5%. This is what people call the Hindu rate of growth. But for 3.5% from what was 0.1 or 0.2% earlier is a dramatic improvement. We look back on it because we hope that we should have done better. We think that it is far too low. We should also remember that in 1950, literacy was probably in single figures. Life expectancy was around 30 years. So on most indicators, it was a desperately poor and underdeveloped economy. From 1980, that's the time when effectively planning was loosened. Market forces became more important. India took the first IMF loan in 1981, and the then finance minister, R. Venkatraman, who later became president, actually said we don't really need the loan, but we're taking it because there may be problems in future, and this is a kind of insurance. And this was actually returned ahead of time. I think the reason was taken was that the IMF has conditions under which they give a loan. And politically, it became easy for us to say that the change from the planning era to a loosening up of the economy, which we wanted to do, but politically was seen as difficult. And therefore, the IMF loan came in rather handy. So from 80 for the next 10 to 15 years, I'd say up to 92, 93, the growth rate was 5%. It increased from 3.5 for the earlier 30 years to about 5%. That is an increase. And as we all know that around 91, there was a massive foreign exchange, balance of payments, fiscal crisis. The story is told about how tons of gold were moved from the Reserve Bank in Bombay to London in order to guarantee loans. And the direction changed from an administered, controlled economy to one with much greater reliance on free markets. Now, I want to make the point that I don't use the word socialist for what we had before, because the Planning Commission, for example, never had the power to implement its plans. It said this is a desired direction, but it could not implement it, which is very different from the Soviet Union. And during all this time, we had a vibrant private sector. All the big houses were there, Birlas, Tatas, Singhanias, Sarabhais, all of them were there. So what we had was a mixed economy with a lot of administrative control. And what happened in 91 when Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister and Manmohan Singh the Finance Minister was a loosening of the controls. Correctly, I think we should call it liberalization, where the government's power of licensing. I remember when I joined IIIT-Bangalore in the 70s, and the institute wanted to purchase that old IBM computer, which is a huge thing. We couldn't do it because we needed permission from the government of India. And the government of India would say, but it will create unemployment, it will do all kinds of things. So from that kind of total micro control, where even a private sector company had to get permission about what it could produce, how much it could produce, where it could produce, what technology it could use, we loosened up. And that is the licensing system, or the license Raj, was slowly dismantled. And this let loose the creativity of the Indian entrepreneur. There were many of us, I'm one of those, who thought that it would lead to deindustrialization, because India did not really have a competitive edge at that time compared to Korea, Taiwan, and such countries. But fortunately, that did not happen. Several industries grew extremely well. Building on the base that the public laid, what I would call the industrial backbone: steel, improved railways, heavy electricals, Bharat Electronics, a whole series of industries and capacities. And it's on this basis that the private sector could then take off. And one industry that grew remarkably was the automobile industry, particularly a lot of automobile components. Story is not a simple one. Maruti came in, it was allowed. It's a long story. But the fact remains that there was a spurt of growth, and this was largely private driven. So the private sector of the economy took off. As you all know, this was the era when the IT boom took place. A large number of Indian companies did very well. They provided services, starting with body shopping, but then went up the value chain, and what we call the global delivery model and all the rest that came after that. So it transformed the nature of the Indian economy. And from 95 up to, for example, 2015, with a blip into 2008, we always grow above 6%, sometimes up to 7.5%, but a significant break in trend in terms of growth. The structure of the economy also changed. The traditional way in which we look at the structure is in two terms. One is what percentage of incomes come from agriculture, industry, and services. In India, today agriculture is probably 15% less of GDP. This doesn't mean it has grown faster, that as a proportion, agricultural production also around 15 to 18%, and the rest is residual sector we call services. There's also been a change in what is included in services. The telephone industry, which would have been called industry earlier, to a large extent as telecommunications, has become services. So some reclassification has taken place. But today the largest sector is the service sector. Now, this is the structure of the economy when we look at the share of income provided by each sector. Now, one feature of advanced economies like Europe, UK, US, is that the share of the economy, whether it is seen in terms of income or whether it's seen in terms of employment, is roughly the same. In the UK, about 3% of income comes from agriculture, and about 3% of the workforce is employed in agriculture. And this is true of most of the other countries. But what has happened in India is that in terms of employment, the agriculture sector still accounts for probably 60-65%. The other two sectors account for the rest. The industrial sector, probably the organized sector, will account for something like 20 million jobs, which is not such a big number given the size of our workforce. And the rest are in all kinds of services. Now, this is a big anomaly, and this is something that has been engaging economists for some time now. And it's one way to understand, for example, poverty. If 15% is the contribution in income of the agriculture sector, but it supports 60+% of the workforce, obviously the per capita contribution is very small. And there are reasons for this. There are many explanations given for this. But when we look at it today, it is because what we call the Indian economy functions through the market, which is very important for the modern sector to which most of us belong. But this modern sector is crucially dependent upon the services it receives from the 90% that we call informal. How does this work? I mean, it's very simple. For example, security services in any modern institution are outsourced. They are outsourced through some security agencies. A fair wage, according to law, is paid to the security agencies. But the security agencies keep a part of it, and what actually goes to the security guard is a small amount. And this outsourced sector, the farmers, the informal workers, garment workers, small industrial sector workers, is what we call the informal sector or the unorganized sector. These terms originate from legislation. In the early years, we passed a law in which we defined a worker as one who belongs to a unit that employs 10 or more people using power, or 20 or more people without power. And this led to a situation in which a large number of small industries would officially employ 8 people and outsource the rest, not show them on the records as employees. This also led to the situation where there was a wage disparity. The organized sector was entitled to provident fund, medical benefits, ESI, all kinds of other benefits, and these were not given to the informal sector, also called unorganized sector. So, to a large extent, the growth of the industry was basic. I mean, the logic is the same as body shopping in the sense that you beat down wages in the informal sector for work that a formal sector worker would be paid much more for. Now, as in the last 20-25 years, the economy and industry grew, a lot of these growth industries are located in urban centers. The growth in Delhi, the growth in Bombay, Pune, Bangalore, other centers. So the demand for labor was in these centers, and where would the workers come from? There was a lot of unemployment in the poorer regions, poorer agricultural regions of Bihar, Odisha, West Bengal, Assam. So there was a movement from the north and eastern part of the country to the west and southern part of the country. And there are government statistics which say that what they call internal migration could be as much as 100 million people in a year. These are huge numbers. And the Labor Department, Labor Ministry has a lot of this. There's been a great deal of research among labor economists on this issue. But the growth strategy that has been followed with delicensing has been a market-friendly one for industry, that we should encourage growth, and if there is enough growth, the benefits of that growth will trickle down. Now, it's done in good faith. There's no particular reason to think this doesn't work. It did happen in Korea, it did happen in Taiwan, it happened in Thailand, but unfortunately that did not happen in India. And I think one of the main reasons is this distinction. We should have defined a worker rather than an organized worker. Now, what this meant was that the informal sector and the formal sector were linked in essential ways, but that the benefits went only into the organized sector. The unorganized sector lived by the skin of its teeth. However, so long as there was growth and some positive policies that the government followed, for example, the food security scheme, improvement in the public distribution system, the passing of the Employment Guarantee Act, and so on, it ensured that distress was avoided. Then came the crisis of 2008, but this was largely a financial crisis. It hit the advanced world very badly. It came through the defaulting of what they call subprime loans, largely loans given for housing in Europe and the US. It did not really hit us. Now, one reason for that is that the basis on which a house loan is given in India is based upon our earning capacity. Most of us will be entitled to go to HDFC or some other company and take a housing loan. But they'll ask for your salary certificate and ensure that the repayment that you have to make per month will never exceed 30% of your salary. Whereas in the US, the assessment was based on the value of the house. So if you bought a house that was worth $50,000 and paid for it, and the value of that house rose to $100,000, then you could go to the bank and say, there's $50,000 more, give me a loan for $30,000. And once this began, this is what became subprime. Taking a loan on the notional value of an asset. So long as the asset values were increasing, there was no problem. But once the financial crisis hit, the banks foreclosed the loans. People could not pay the loans. They gave up the houses. The housing values fell. There was a big crisis. And the government bailed out the banks. Now, there was a choice. The governments could have said that we look at all those who are defaulting on loans and up to, say, a certain limit, $75,000 or $100,000, we'll pay those free. No, but what the government did was to say that we give money to the banks so that their balance sheets are protected and the banks can still collect the loans that they are owed. Now, this did not happen in India. This is one reason why we didn't feel the financial crisis as much. The second thing is the speculative nature of the international markets. To deal in subprime assets, the minimum purchase had to be $50 million. Now, the only bank that had any kind of outstanding in this was ICICI with $300 million. Can you imagine the public sector banks taking a risk of one purchase of $50 million? Now, they were risk averse, they did not do it. Now, whether you give the credit to the Reserve Bank of India or to the stock is a different matter. But we largely escaped the worst excesses and problems of the financial crisis. Now, let me move a little further to more recent times. There was a big change of government in 2014. And from 2014 onwards, the ease of doing business became very much more important than it was in the earlier regime. Yes, we had a much larger base of industrial growth, but it became a very much more important criterion. And if you look at all the indices that are now being given out, it's around the ease of doing business, a very pro-industry kind of policy. This was facilitated by one external factor which was in our favor. Throughout this period, oil prices were very low abroad. I mean, Manmohan Singh had to deal with oil prices at almost $100 a barrel. But they even came down to 25 post 20. And even when they went up to 60. And as a large oil importing country, India was a beneficiary. And this enabled the government to fund its various projects for the ease of doing business. However, in the attempt at cracking down on corruption, the government decided to demonetize this, I think, 2016. This decision taken in November to make all notes of 500 and 1,000 not legal tender. Very complicated decision, but it threw out 80% or 80+% of the cash in circulation, so that economic activity just came to a standstill. Now, this did not hit all sectors equally. The informal sector I've been talking about is largely a cash-dependent sector. The people who are outside selling us vegetables and the pani puri walas and fruit sellers and so on. So taking cash out of the system led to a differential impact, and a whole part of the economy suffered a blow from which I don't think it is still fully recovered. Shortly after this, again, in order to eliminate corruption as one motive, but also as a pro-business move, one nation, one tax, the government introduced the GST, Goods and Services Tax. Now, the Goods and Services Tax is a good design. It's a positive factor in many countries. But one of the features is that if the ease of implementation depends on there being one rate for all goods, all services. Singapore, for example. So there are countries that have rates varying 10, 15 odd %, and it's collected on everything, and it becomes very easy. And the advantage of GST over earlier systems of sales tax and so on is that you don't pay tax on tax. In other words, I buy input from some company which has paid tax. They give me a receipt and I show that to the government. So when I sell the property, I charge tax, but I get a credit for the tax I have paid to the earlier. So there's no tax on tax, and this is a very positive move. But however, ours was an extremely complicated one in our federal structure. For one, the states politically lost the power of taxation, which is one of the powers that defines any government, the power to tax. Secondly, in order to get the idea accepted by all states, some items were kept outside the GST, namely petroleum, oil, liquor, etc., which the states were reluctant to give up. So our GST does not cover all goods and services. And we have multiple rates. There are certain rates that are considered essential at a low rate. There are certain that are standard items varying between 12 and 18%. And there are others that you charge 28%. And there is also something called a cess, because one of the promises the government made was that states which lost out from the transition would be compensated for 5 years, assuming a growth rate of 14% in their revenues. Now, what happened with the GST being implemented was that the economy was thrown into turmoil. Part of it was the bad design, but partly also the hurry, because the IT backbone really collapsed. There are a lot of people who said, we want to pay the tax, but the web is hanging, we can't pay it, it doesn't work properly. I'm paying, but it's on somebody else's account. All kinds of issues came up. So these two led to a collapse in the informal sector, which also meant that the organized sector felt an impact in terms of some of its supplies of raw materials, and the economy began to slow down. I spent a lot of time on this because I wanted to say that at the beginning of this year, although over the last 25 years we've been a growth economy, we were in a state where for the last 1.5 to 2 years, not only was the economy slowing down, employment was rising, distress was high. So this is the background in which we entered the COVID era. Now, let me talk a little bit about COVID. Once again, I'm no expert. The first case was reported in January in Kerala, and Kerala acted very fast. that is interesting because Kerala has been investing in the health sector for the last 20 years. It has a reasonably effective system. It's almost universal. The PDS, the public distribution system, and the health system are used by everybody. Even IAS officers use them. So in a sense, because everybody uses it, it worked reasonably. I'm not saying there's no corruption, but the system worked reasonably well. And Kerala was able to cope with it. They acted very quickly. They started identifying, tracking, tracing, all of this. The first cases came through airports. Ahmedabad did have some cases in February, but February had the Namaste Trump event where 1 lakh people greeted the American president. Early March, there was a lot of political activity. The Madhya Pradesh government came down and so on. But still, when the lockdown was imposed on the 24th of March, there were around 500 cases in India. And these were largely confined to the large urban areas with the transmission being via airports. Now, the lockdown was extremely severe. I think India is the only country which locked down the entire nation suddenly with 4 hours notice, and the economy came to a complete halt. I must say the government has done reasonably well in the sense that essential services were provided. We got our food, we got our electricity, we got our milk supplies. Those things were managed. So it's not a negative thing altogether. But in economic terms, it led to a complete collapse of activity in a situation of a slowing economy. Now, should we have had a lockdown? I don't think the debate is yes lockdown or no lockdown. It is what kind of lockdown, when, and so on. And there are 3 contrasting examples. We have the case of Sweden, which had no lockdown, which said that let people be careful, let's try and build herd immunity, and so on. And compared to its neighbors, it had a fairly high toll of death. So is it a success? Is it not? Then I think it's probably too early to say. Then we had New Zealand, which had a different, it gave 4 days notice. It was also national lockdown, but it was a lockdown that was done at a very personal level as a friendly thing, with the Prime Minister talking on Facebook Live to people, a lot of explanation going on. So it was through moral persuasion and suasion rather than a police action. And overall, the New Zealand thing has worked. I mean, there is suddenly recently a spike of cases. But for, I think, 60 days after the lockdown ended, there were no cases. Yes, both Sweden and New Zealand are very small countries compared to us. And at some point that becomes relevant. The Indian one, on the other hand, was absolute, total, national. And Abhijit Banerjee recently made the statement that India went into the lockdown too early. Maybe this is something that we will learn as we go. But certainly one thing that the lockdown did not do was it was caught by surprise with the number of workers who were stranded in the south and the west who wanted to go back to their states. Closing down of transport meant they had nothing. They were desperate. They wanted to walk. And here our employers don't show up very well. I know that in, for example, the Bangalore real estate industry did not even pay wages for 1st of March to 21st of March. They just stopped and sacked them all. So you had very poor people who were worried about the next meal. It was distressed. They had no houses to go to. Lockdown really meant nothing because social distancing was totally impossible. And our cultural factors are such that when you're desperate, you want to go and die at home. So they all started walking home, and we're all familiar with the situation. Bangalore is particularly sad because even when the government started the Shramik trains, the real estate lobby went to the chief minister and persuaded him to stop them And until there was a lot of public pressure, he did not relent. So I think that it's not a question of lockdown or no lockdown, but ours was a very ill-planned lockdown, and that is on top of slowing economy. Also, I think that we did not make use of the lockdown time to prepare. When the number of cases was small, identification was easy, the tracking was working, tracing, treatment. But I think enough effort was not put in to build the capacity to increase the number of hospital beds when whatever was required. There are vivid pictures in Bangalore after unlock when they started building up the center in North Bangalore. So I think there was also a government failure in terms of how we use the lockdown time. So that's the other one. Now, part of the difficulty that comes up is that there's confusion about numbers. How many are tested on a given day? I read reports that fatalities in India are relatively low, that the virus is not mutating as it might have, that it's the elderly who are the vulnerable section. But then the elderly are the vulnerable section to all other diseases as well. I don't think that is COVID specific. So I'm not sure what to make of the numbers from whatever I read. How many were tested today? It depends on when they felt they had an infection, when they reported it, when they got the test, and even more importantly, how long the test results took. So if you say that yesterday 1,000 cases were reported, it could be anything for the last 4 or 5 days. It's not last 24 hours. So there's been a lot of this problem, and this is something we have to sort out before we can come to any kind of picture. Unfortunately, this number about the confusion on numbers and statistics is also an issue in the economic data. In all my student days and all the years I've been looking at India, we talked about the limitations of data, the NSS, the census, whatever. But we never questioned the integrity of the data. But in the last couple of years, that has come into question. We've had members of the National Statistical Commission resigning in protest. A lot of changes have been happening. The periodic labor participation survey, PLFI, was not released because it showed high levels of unemployment, and there's been a rather unpleasant debate around this. It has shaken our faith in the statistical system, which means that almost anything we say can be questioned for a reason that was never important before, the integrity of data. Now, where does this take us all? One thing that we've learned is that there's a difference between a deadly virus and a dangerous virus. MERS and SARS were deadly because the fatality rates were very high. This COVID-19 is dangerous because it spreads very fast, but the fatality rates are much lower. So yes, it's dangerous, but it is not deadly. And how this should go into planning a response is something we have to think about. The working age population, if I understand whatever I've been reading correctly, is less exposed, or rather it may be exposed, but even if it gets the infection, the incidence of the disease is moderate. They recover mostly. And today, newspaper says that recoveries are increasing and the infection rate is falling in Bangalore and probably in other places as well. So I don't know how this particular factor has to be taken into account. The question of vaccine, so far there is no vaccine, there's been research. But once again, the unfortunate fact is that there's been a debate about the quality and reliability of the testing process and the trials that are to be done. So it's unfortunate, but one of the lessons that I've learned is to be very, very skeptical about claims that are being made. But that doesn't help in any way, because then what do we do? How do we design a policy? So if I may summarize, Our lockdown did not work, but that doesn't mean lockdowns don't work. We should have planned it better. We should probably have a much more decentralized system of lockdowns. Lawyers have been talking about using the Disaster Management Act vested in the Home Ministry rather than other acts that are vested in the states and Health Ministry. There's a whole series of questions that have come up. And I would hope that we learn lessons from this for future epidemics. The other lesson is that I think we reacted in panic. New Zealand had a prime minister in her 30s. All our leaders are in their 70s. So is it that the elderly being vulnerable panicked? I mean, I don't know. One cannot say that panic guided decision making. I cannot make that kind of statement. But it seems to me, but in our response in the lockdowns, the messages that were given were more threatening that, look, if you get infection, you will die. The messages should have been much more around using the mask, why social distancing is important, how Dharavi, which has no social, has dealt with it, positive stories that would inspire people rather than this fear. So one thing is that COVID has taught us that we should not be afraid, we should not panic. The other thing from an economic point of view is that the policies that we've been followed, which have been completely focused on growth at any cost almost. We should pursue a policy which looks at employment. And it's an interesting thing that even in the planning era, employment was mentioned in, say, the 6th and 7th plans. But we've never seen employment as an objective of economic policy. We could have had a policy which said we want to ensure that unemployment falls to, say, 5%, and followed policies that would ensure work, and then seeing the growth rate as a derivative. On the other hand, we set the growth rate as the goal, and the result has been, growing unemployment. And unemployment obviously means poverty. I don't want to go into the debates about 31 rupees per day and so on. But the fact is that poverty is multidimensional. It will not solve itself. We have not had trickle-down growth. And in this, I would sign with the Sen side of the debate in the Sen Bhagwati arguments, where direct policies to deal with hunger, with schooling are needed, and these won't happen on their own. And this is an important point because it means that the state has to be more active in this. I'm not arguing for a small state, centralized state, or anything of the fact. The state, in the abstract political sense of the nation state or a political entity, cannot abdicate its responsibilities for investment in schooling, health, welfare, pensions, etc. And the countries that have coped well with this crisis are those which have these social security systems in place. Now, one reason that we've always been told for the low investments in health and education is that there's no fiscal space. We don't have money. But I think this is a political decision that has been taken by all governments of the last 30 odd years, that a business-friendly policy means low rates of tax, and the low rates of tax are a given. It was Chidambaram who started with the 30% marginal rate being the highest rate of tax. It has continued. But a 30% marginal rate of tax that includes me and Mukesh Ambani, I'm not very sure that is socialist. There's something there that one could question. So there is a case for looking at the structure of direct taxes. I'm not saying increase taxes on the middle class, but I'm saying examine it so as to increase revenue and collect a fair amount from those who have a large disposable income. The second point is that we've treated capital gains very favorably. If I invest in the stock market and make some gains, I pay a lower tax on that than I would on money I get as a salary. I think this discrimination in favor of rentier income should go. a capitalist state like the United States has an estate tax. The capitalist system believes that you should make your own money, and it's not that you put it in endowments or something. It's a feudal society which says that I'm the Raja and I'll hand over things to my son and grandson and so on. So the absence of an estate duty, it may not raise too much revenue, but as a signal in the market, it's something that's very important. So I think one of the opportunities of rethinking that COVID has given to us is to say that, yes, we can re-examine taxes, we can raise more resources, we can employ people where they're needed. For example, frontline health workers, frontline teachers. I think this is for forest guards, in agriculture. These are the areas of where employment will grow at the front line. And if we have to use a wage subsidy rather than a capital interest, and Britain used wage subsidies very well after the war, when soldiers were coming back and they were worried about, how to employ them. So there are economic tools that can be done, and it's a strange conclusion to come to, but COVID has forced us to look back on knowledge that's more than, say, 40 years old, and look to economic models and ideas that existed then for a solution, and not believe in supply side economics that has dominated all economic policy until now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I think we can give a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There are a few questions on the chat. Prasanna has asked quite a few. So the first question Prasanna has asked is the situation now not similar with low value and raw material and service exports and opposite types of imports?
It's certainly low value because the unorganized sector uses very low levels of technology. It depends upon people working for long hours rather than being productive per hour. So yes, he's right. It's a low value kind of economy.
Is there an analysis in disaggregated real terms rather than monetary terms alone? For example, what portion of a button, a pin is made versus imported? How do you measure relative quality in PPP analysis? Concrete example, rubber bands in India often degrade in 6 months, while the same is not the case with stuff elsewhere. Similarly, fence or steel work edges are sharp in India but rounded elsewhere. Is there a detailed analysis of this taken into account in PPP? We need to address these real aspects to improve our import-export balance profile, etc.
See, PPP calculations are indicative calculations. They were made famous by The Economist and its hamburger index. The question it asked is, the hamburger is a standard product, and how much do you pay in different countries for it? And then it said that is the equivalence of exchange, not what we pay when we buy foreign exchange. But while that is a useful thing to make the point that price structures are different in different countries, it's very hard to extend that to a higher level. I cannot say I want to compare PPP, the gross domestic product of India, PPP, with the US, and then it becomes extremely confusing. Okay. But there have been a lot of detailed studies, places like the IIM and others, a lot of sectoral studies that have looked at it. But unfortunately, and this is really unfortunate, industrial economics is not an important area in India. We have a large number of agricultural economists, trade economists, but very, very few. The last top class one I can think of is Prof. R.K. Hazari, who was Reserve Bank Deputy Governor and whose work is in the 60s and 70s.
KB Mehta makes a comment. Problems of hygiene, literacy, cultural, social, and sanitation were also major factors for Indian decision, I guess, on lockdown when compared to Sweden and New Zealand. That's just a comment. Prasanna again. What is the likely impact on education and work since mass vaccination, even if we get a vaccine candidate by 2021, will take a year, if not several years? unless you have mass vaccination and it is scientifically certified, we cannot operate normally. Do you
No, that is true. About the vaccination, that is true, what he says.
Any comments on impact on education and work until the vaccination comes in?
Education, I don't know, it's a very big thing. But the question of work is a lot depends on the policies we now follow. Does work mean employment? I think that if you're working, you should be employed, and that requires legal and other structures. In the short run, it would mean that cost of production would go up, but we should be able to do that through improved productivity. It's a difficult thing, but if we don't do those things, then we are stuck with this poor informal sector and low quality. We've got away with it because low quality is sold in India, and the export market is a very different thing altogether.
Shivakumar Malapaka has asked, many of the attempts that were made until now to contain the spread, including Dharavi, were trial and error, if he understands. So how can one set a protocol when it is still a trial and error?
Well, what do? We don't know enough. Even the experts are saying they don't understand COVID. So it has to be trial and error. There will be errors, there will be successes. I think the institutional capacity to learn from the successes and what works really will define how we go. I think we need to study Dharavi a lot. Bhilwara is another case of success. Kerala at a state level. So there are, Odisha surprisingly here has done extremely well. But we don't know enough in detail. And my hunch is that at the end of the day, it's going to be districts and states at which level you have to decide on how to implement something. The general policy of stopping transmission is okay at a general level, but how it is to be done will probably be very local.
Okay, KP Mehta pays you a compliment. He says, interesting, informative, well-balanced talk. Clarified several issues, raised some questions, indicates Indian economy will continue to suffer for a while. Incomes will continue to suffer and so will the people. Not a great picture. Thank you, Professor Vinod.
Thank you very much.
Shivakumar Malapaka again. Also, do you think government used this time to push some important reforms like in agriculture?
Unfortunately, many of the reforms the government has pushed are highly controversial. The labor reforms, removing minimum wage, minimum working hours, etc., in my view, are not progressive. My friends who are experts in agricultural economics are not convinced about some of the changes they're doing. And this is very important because, surprisingly, the last year has seen a bumper crop in agriculture. With all the lockdown, with all the disruptions in supply chains, we've had a record harvest. But that doesn't mean that farmers are well off, because a lot depends on the traders and margins and storage and warehouse and all the other post-harvest matters. These are areas we have to look at. But I think the changes that have been bulldozed by government through ordinances, even if they're good, will only work if there is a much wider discussion and understanding and acceptance. Pushing them through because, politically it's possible to do so, may not lead to success in implementation.
Ashwini Pandey asked, Sir, what's your take on UBI as a growing economic inequality and unemployment in our society?
I think it's a very good idea. How we implement it matters. It should be implemented at state and lower. The formulation should be for each state. The design should not be all India. And at a lower level, the details of implementation, there should be power to tweak. Also, the UBI should not mean that the government doesn't give free schools and health and so on. The UBI should be on top of certain other rights that, for example, the food security law, the right to education, etc. confer. In which case, I think that this is basically what countries like Germany and France have done. They've ensured that even if you lose your job, the unemployment insurance and things that kick in. And unemployment insurance is a kind of UBI because you need it when you don't have an income. The Employment Guarantee Act, for example, is something like that. When you are in distress, you ask for it. I've been reading that in Kerala, the unemployed engineers have been using it because they say with some self-respect, we earn 300 rupees a day. And it's based on your work. It's demand-driven. When I feel I have a better opportunity, I don't use it. But we've confined it to rural areas. We should extend it to all areas.
Bhargav asked, the 20,000 crore package was introduced, which nearly 10% of India's GDP was given up to boost India's weakening economic sectors. Was there any alternative for this rather than just giving up like this? Was it a wise move, according to you, as many people claim that they are not benefited from it?
See, the 20,000 crores is a bit of a dicey number. What should come as a fiscal policy is money that the government spends. And from all the calculations that I've seen, that is the increase in employment guarantee days, public distribution of food, etc., come to about 1% or 1.25% of GDP. The rest of the money is through the financial system. What the government has done is to say that the terms under which banks can give loans are relaxed so that they don't count as bad loans if not repaid. And for example, I think it's 5,000 crores that is meant for micro and small enterprises. Now, this is administered through the SIDBI, the Small Industries Development Bank of India. The SIDBI, on the other hand, has then gone and said that we will give you a loan, but you must repay it in 90 days. No rate of interest, yes, that is the subsidy element. But at a time like this, no one will take a loan because they're not confident that they can sell their goods, recover the money, and repay the bank. So it's no surprise that the announcement has been made, but in the same way, the agricultural thing is operated through NABARD. And yes, there are increase in the number of tractors that are being bought, but that is because the large farmers are using this concessional loan to buy up tractors, which are long-term assets. It's not going to the small farmer who needs money for seeds or fertilizer. So this number is a very dicey number. Most economists don't.
Shivakumar says, thank you, sir. KB Mehta asks a question. What is one major economic policy action required from the government at this stage?
Again, you get opinions. I'll give you mine. I think that immediately the government should make a certain amount of money available, say, we can debate the exact number, but say 5,000 rupees a month to anyone who has an Aadhaar number. Those of us who don't need it can say we don't want it, but it should be given because I think you can see around you the kind of distress. Some of us have been very good and we paid our cooks and drivers during the lockdown, but I hear a lot of stories of distress around this. Schooling, online teaching is fine for me, but how is it for somebody who doesn't have a phone? I don't know if you all saw the letter written by Professor Arjun Jaidev of Azim Premji University's students. He said that one day when he was teaching a class, he saw that one particular person was, on the line, offline. So he phoned him up and he found that this boy was sitting outside the house with an umbrella in rain because the only point he could get Wi-Fi. So he wrote this letter saying, I admire the efforts you're making. And therefore, we have to understand the structure of the economy and plug that. And that can only be done at a local level. I cannot have a scheme saying, give every student who's holding an umbrella in the rain. That's not going to work. What you've got to say is make money available at the panchayat or municipal level and say, use this money to reduce it. And at that particular, some corruption will be there. But people also see who gets the benefits and who don't. And here there is experience in Karnataka in the decentralization done by Ramakrishna Hegde in the 80s, which gave powers, which gave the district Zilla Panchayat Adhyaks the rank of minister and the powers to disburse money. And if you study the evaluation reports of that time to now, there was a dramatic improvement. So I think it's worth trying. We shouldn't be afraid of some corruption because there is already corruption anyway. Let's try and see if along with corruption, we also get some benefits.
Hello, thank you, sir. Thank you for an interesting talk. I do understand that the unemployment and the work situation that currently exists is something that requires careful thought and say discussion. Now, in these situations, so while you say that there needs to be decentralization or there needs to be passing on the control, so rather than the National Disaster Management Act, for example, being made the instrument, we could have, or we could probably think of something that states and districts can fall back upon to make interventions in a context like this. Now, what I would want to understand from you is, and I do see this need and this acceptance or tolerance towards corruption, as you may call it, to sustain something like that. But also in terms of so when you have an something like a digital identity which is centralized, and various such instruments that are centralized, in this situation, how do you ensure meaningful decentralization? Can that be a knee-jerk reaction at this point when our entire administrative structures are so centralized and are moving towards a greater centralizing direction? And I believe that that's why we have not been able to celebrate Kerala as much as we should. We have not been able to talk about Bhilwara or Dharavi as much as we should. And we have always been looking up to Delhi for any directions on how our hospital should be managed in the local ward.
But I don't think that's a question. That's a separate Samvaad discussion. It's an extremely complicated thing. I think it's an ongoing discussion. All I would say is that the current structure, for example, look at Bangalore. The Commissioner of Bangalore is an IS officer controlled from Delhi. The mayor who's elected has no say in anything. Now, it's the mayor who's elected who's worried about re-election, who should be making decisions. So this is an example of the disconnect between administration and local politics. In the same way, if you look at Zilla Parishad, there is an elected Adhyaksh, but all powers are vested in the chief executive officer, who's a junior IS officer. So there are a lot of problems like this, but this requires a very detailed discussion. I don't think I can give you any simple answer.
Yeah, I do realize, sir. But is this an occasion to maybe celebrate or increase the intensity of our calls for acknowledging the local much more? Now that even the Prime Minister says we need to be vocal for the local, should that local be at a national scale, or can that local be at the scale of a district and the state also?
I think so. It's like a Mao's statement, let 1,000 flowers bloom. You know, yes, we will make mistakes. We certainly will make mistakes. But I agree with you that this is we must, if nothing else, intensify the demand and debate.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Bhargav asked a question. The Russia claims to have corona vaccine and also announced this officially. How does a country be benefited if a vaccine is produced? Can the economy of the country radically change because of this?
A lot depends how effective the vaccine is. It will certainly raise confidence. It's like we're not afraid of TB. You know, we're not afraid of influenza. There are vaccines and we can deal with it. So what it will do is it will make us go back to the normal, whatever that is. Whether the Russian thing is valid or not, time will tell. We have our own trials going on with Bharat Biotech. I hope they work, but you don't know.
Ashwini Pandey again. I think we'll close with this question. Sir, India's debt to GDP ratio is less than 100%, and with FRBM Act, should there be any caps on fiscal deficit in developing market to boost the economy?
There is a case for the government to be responsible in its finances. Whether that should be an act or not, the fact is government should be responsible. In the current situation of a pandemic, I don't think we should worry so much. If government spends money, I don't see this today as a stimulus. I see it basically as income support in a situation of distress. And if that leads to growth, what will happen is that the growth in the GDP will to some extent look after the percentage of debt that the government has. So in a growing economy, even if we spend money now, by the time repayment comes, it will be a smaller percentage. So, but what I will say is that the critical thing here is the kind of expenditure. If we breach the FRBM and spend money and buy Rafale jets, that's not going to help the economy. It may help defense. But if we give out 5,000 rupees to poor people, they will eat, there'll be less distress, there'll be less demand on health services, and hopefully they'll be more productive. So these are choices. I want to also say that there's no one solution in these. These social matters, how we define the problem changes, the importance we give to different things change, our perception of priorities changes. So the only answer is that we need a democratically elected government that decides for you. You may differ from it, but at least it has the legitimacy of electoral benefits. So there is no straightforward answer, and that is one of the things that keeps me in the social sciences. Unlike scientists who get a clear-cut answer or a measurement, we are always in the maybe, perhaps, perhaps not, if only, etc.
Thank you, Professor. It has been a great discussion. Thank you once again for giving a talk at Samvaad. So we'll close the call right now.